Okay, well, welcome, friends. You all know me, Reverend Kristen Yates, the Associate Pastor for Spiritual Formation and Congregational Care. And I just want to welcome you who are joining us in this Zoom space, also on Facebook Live, and also for those of you who join us later. We are excited that you're here for our first Perspectives. Now, Perspectives is our weekly space for teaching and discussion on a wide range of topics. So each week we're going to have a new speaker from our congregation come and engage us on some topic that they really love. And then each week your hosts, which are me and Emily Bingham. Emily, if you want to wave your hands. Me and Emily will engage you in some discussion questions around whatever topic we explored that night. So we are super excited for all the topics we have lined up, and we're excited for tonight's topic, where our very own Father William Eavenson is going to be engaging us in a talk called "What Do I Do with Doubt? Wrestling with Faith and Doubt Throughout the History of Christianity from Biblical Times to Today." So we're excited that you're here, William. Thanks for doing this tonight. And with that, you can get started. And let me see if I can pin you so that everyone can see you. Okay.
Awesome. Well, hey guys, it is great to be with you tonight. Thank you so much, Reverend Kristen and Emily, for the invitation to help kick off this super exciting series. I hope that you guys will tune into these. I got a chance to see the whole calendar of all of the different conversation topics that will be taking place over the course of this fall, and it's an incredible group of people who will be presenting this incredible group of topics that will be discussed. And so my hope tonight is to set the stage a little bit for the types of conversations we hope to have. I hope you're not coming expecting me to answer all of your questions. In a lot of ways, I see my role tonight to try to spark deeper conversation for us to have together about all of the issues about faith and doubt. One of the things that I'm super passionate about is figuring out how can we have space to earnestly and deeply wrestle as the people of God about important attributes of the character of God, about important aspects of the pursuit of Christ within the church. I think a lot of us feel for some reason censored with our real questions when we come into religious spaces. And my desire is to say, if Jesus is the incarnate God, if he is the personification of grace and truth in its fullness, then there is safety and there is permission in his presence to be able to engage him with our whole heart and our whole intellect. So let's dive in tonight. My hope in these next few minutes is, again, not to answer all of your questions, but to spark some bigger questions that we can engage in together. So if you're tuning in via Facebook Live and not a part of this Zoom conversation, you can comment questions that you have on the Facebook Live video, and we'll be able to address them in the Q&A. So with that, let's begin. James 1:5-8 reads, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do." Verses like this made a lot of us who grew up in the American church terrified of doubt. Doubt, Sunday school taught us, either implicitly or explicitly, is like a weed that is mercilessly bent on destroying the faith flowers in your garden. And you got to be hyper vigilant, always on your guard to root it out and keep it from taking over. And fast forward a few years, and many kids who grew up in the church are leaving the church. And a good many are leaving Christianity as well on the grounds that they feel that they no longer believe in God. And in conversation, and I promise you, my thoughts on this come out of countless individual one-on-one, heart-to-heart, deep conversations with real people like me and like you who are asking real questions. So I'm not throwing statistics out here. I'm talking about people that I love and conversations that they're having in their real lives. But in conversation, this no longer believing is often explained as questions about the church's relationship to the LGBTQ community, wrestling with the problem of evil, concern over whether the Christian faith helps or hinders the work of public justice making in the public square, questions about what role organized religion can or should play in the continued cultivation of faith, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm certain this is not true for every person who shares such questions or thoughts. But the sense that I get from folks like those I described above who have walked away from Christianity is that in their minds, when it came to their life story, doubt won. It took over the garden. There are no more faith flowers. And so the only logical conclusion is to quietly opt out of the whole Christianity club because, quote, I no longer belong. And I guess one of the questions that I wanted to ask tonight is, what are we talking about when we talk about doubt? How is doubt the same or different from questions about faith or seriously intellectually wrestling with the tenets of Christian belief or the historical Jesus? What are we talking about when we talk about faith? How is faith the same or different from certainty or blind and unthinking trust in simply what our parents told us or, quote, what the Bible says, according to other people who claim that they know what the Bible says in the first place? And I certainly don't have all the answers for this. And again, I didn't promise you I would, so I haven't broken any promises there. But there are a couple observations about our culture, the history of Christianity, and the Bible that I think are important considerations for any meaningful conversation about doubt and any meaningful way forward in the life of faith. And the first observation is this. I think we live in a society that has replaced faith with certainty. And here's what I mean by that. If someone were to say, I doubt global warming is real, what would they mean by that? And my contention is that they mean that a review of the scientific evidence, at least the portion of the evidence that they have examined, leads them to be uncertain about the claims environmentalists are making about the scope, impact, and causes of climate change. If, on the other hand, someone says, I believe in global warming, well, what are they talking about? They mean that a review of the scientific evidence, at least the portion of the evidence that they have examined, leads them to be certain about the claims environmentalists have made about climate change. Thus, when it comes to climate change, doubt means uncertainty, and faith means certainty. And we can trace this societal equation of doubt with uncertainty and faith with certainty back to the modern establishment of what we now call the scientific method. The scientific method came into common usage during a period known as the Enlightenment, roughly during the 17th century. And the scientific method involves experiments. A scientist makes a hypothesis about something they don't know. For example, an incredibly oversimplified gravity. The notion that objects exert attractive force in proportion to their mass. If that's what we think gravity is, then we should be able to design repeatable experiments to test it. If upon repeated tries, I can observe a tennis ball that I drop off the wall fall to earth, it lends support to my idea that gravity is real. Because the much more massive object of planet Earth is exerting a commensurately strong force on the tennis ball, which pulls it toward the ground. And if multiple people in multiple different places at multiple different times can repeat this experiment and find the same results, the original hypothesis becomes a theory. And something the scientific community commonly agrees to be true, or in essence believes, because we've repeatedly observed it to be the case. And the scientific method has been amazing for Western technological advances in the past few centuries. In fact, it's been so successful at advancing science that other disciplines have begun to apply it. Take American business, for example, which tracks observable results. which in turn has led to growth in profits and massive business expansion. And even the church in America, and most notably the American megachurch, has taken American business practices based as they are off of the scientific method and applied them to the life of the faith community. At the popular level, such action has often led American Christians to believe that God is at work in a congregation if it is growing quickly. In other words, in a society governed by the scientific method, faith is gauged as real to the extent that we can observe and measure that it works. But as an individual in your own brain and heart, how do you know when faith is working or not? It's not as easy to discern as gravity or megachurch growth, is it? And so I can't prove this, but I think it likely. American Christians have developed a couple different faith brands based on ways that we can measure whether faith is working. And the prosperity gospel is one of these. The prosperity gospel teaches that our love for Jesus and faithfulness to him will result in God's blessings, specifically financial prosperity, physical health, and pleasantness of circumstances. And what's nice about the prosperity gospel is that I can measure it. I can tell if my bank account balance is going up, if my cholesterol is going down, or if my days are happier or filled with less adversity. And so to the extent that these metrics trend positive, I can, according to the prosperity gospel, be confident that my faith is working for me. Another example is what Walter Brueggemann calls therapeutic deism. And therapeutic deism essentially says God is your teddy bear, and his role is to make you feel better about yourself and your life. And so we design religious experiences that cater towards our feelings in order to make us feel a certain way that we equate emotionally with an experience of God. And to the extent that we feel good about our faith, again, something we can observe and measure, we can be confident that our faith is working for us. But what happens when the bank account balance stops going up? When the house or the marriage falls apart? When I stop feeling anything when I listen to worship music, hear a sermon, or read the Bible? I have no measurements by which I can observe that my faith is working anymore. My hunch is that many Americans look at the lack of measurable results based on the synthetic metrics set by things like the prosperity gospel or therapeutic deism and conclude, I must not believe anymore. I examine the evidence presented from these fields of inquiry and conclude I am no longer certain God is real or that my faith is genuine. And this uncertainty must mean the presence of doubt, or in other words, the loss of the garden, and the conclusion that I am in fact no longer a Christian. But I wonder tonight, is faith supposed to be measurable? Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as being, quote, sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And that seems kind of at odds with the scientific method. And so in a society that has replaced faith with certainty based on measurable results we can see, we should wonder, how much should our faith have to do with the scientific method? Is part of the reason we think that we're doubting because our society has taught us to label some of our experiences as doubt when the scriptures would never call our experiences that? Some examples. Asking good, tough, honest, intellectual questions is not doubt. I would argue that is faith seeking understanding. In his book, Reading While Black, author and New Testament professor Esau McCaulley writes that one of the things that spurred on his academic career was a desire to, quote, leave behind easy answers and start asking better questions. I like his additional reflection that he dropped his religion major in undergrad, quote, not because it challenged his faith with hard questions, but because it didn't ask the right hard questions. Faith opens our imagination to bigger and better questions. High school Bible study kids ask about sex. They ask, how far is too far according to God and the Bible when it comes to physicality and dating relationships? When the Bible thinks about sexuality, the Bible asks, what is a human being for? That is a much bigger and more engaging question that will lead to other big questions. And Christianity contends that the honest asking of all of our questions will lead us to the crucified and risen Jesus, who is God in the flesh, the fruition of all for which we long, the incarnation of the truth that we really seek. And restless, smart, persistent pursuit of him is not doubt. It is, in fact, the fullness of faith. Likewise, an absence of religious feeling is not doubt. I would argue the very notion that genuine faith should be measured by religious feeling is a product of American consumer Christianity, where churches and evangelism organizations have kept upping the ante of sound systems, set designs, and interactive elements to try to keep making us feel more, cultivating a generation of essentially religious junkies endlessly craving another fix. But that is not what I see in the spirituality of the Bible or even Christians throughout history. In the scriptures, I see some of the heroes and the heroines of faith commended for dying before they experienced the promises of God realized in their lives. I see people say yes to God and their lives get harder rather than easier. I see God not preventing people from experiencing difficulty, but protecting them and providing for them in the midst of it, sometimes at the very last second. And sometimes people die and lose everything for their faith. The majority of early century Christians were martyred, sometimes brutally, for following Jesus. Christians in the 4th and 5th centuries sought God in the desert while living lives of solitude, silence, and prayer, far away from the excesses and cultural amenities of the empire. Jesus for them wasn't the key to unlocking the Roman imperial dream. He was someone who for some could only be truly sought away from the ungodly temptations and idolatries that dream held out on offer. In his book, The Meaning of Marriage, author Tim Keller speaks of the relationship between the feelings of love and the actions of love. When we fall in love with someone, Keller writes, we usually feel very strongly about that person. Our feelings cause us to act towards that person in love, which in turn engenders greater feelings. There will, however, come a point in the relationship, if it endures, when the feelings of love will diminish and maybe cease entirely. And if you continue to act towards that person in love, over time, the feelings will return. If Keller's description of marriage is an appropriate metaphor for the life of faith, which I would argue it is, since the purpose of marriage, according to the scriptures, is to showcase the love of God for the church, then it should not be surprising that even if we felt amazing things from God when we first came to Christ, that those feelings might cease over time. And indeed, that we might journey through years in which we continue to act towards God in genuine faithfulness, even though we feel nothing to emotionally indicate that he is there. Such an experience would not be doubt, but would instead be deeper faith. In letters published after her death, Mother Teresa of Calcutta said that the main reason she wanted to minister to the poor was to experience God's felt presence. But, Mother Teresa continues, from the very first day that she started working with the poor until the last day of her life, she said she never again felt God's presence. And we look at Mother Teresa's life today and see it as an example of great faith, not doubt. Why then should we think that an absence of religious feeling in our lives would equate with doubt? Finally, and you could add a lot of things to this list, but this is the last one that I will end with tonight. A lack of empirical certainty, or in other words, a willingness to admit that you might be wrong, can lead to genuine biblical doubt. But in and of itself, it is not doubt. Facts can point towards faith. There is good historical and logical reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that the scriptures are reliable. But all the best research in the world will only lead you up to the brink of faith. They will bring us to a cliffside of a canyon, but we will still need to take the leap. And Christians believe that the taking of that leap is a great mystery. Somehow there is a dynamic interaction in the leaping whereby God acts and we respond. We jump, but even our volitional action participates in an economy of grace whereby God acted first. In other words, we are met by God in the activity of faith, and a togetherness of participation ensues. We are not left to, quote, figure it out on our own. And yet, in spite of all the evidence and sound reasoning for why we would conclude faith in Jesus as a proper course of action and way to live, we will never be able to empirically prove to someone else in the court of science. If we could, it would no longer be faith. And that is, to me, what makes the adventure of following Jesus so wonderful, precisely because it's not some cold, dead, observably provable thing. But even if I can't prove God to someone else, I can bear witness to a God who has proven himself to me. Because I can catalog a list of things in my life whereby God has acted, moved, and initiated that have changed everything for the better for me. And I can commend that experience to someone else. I can desire such a faith for them, but I can't force them to receive it. They have to take the leap themselves too. And this is where faith breeds a humility. Christians should never be smugly superior as if what we believe is self-evident, because Christian faith is indisputably strange. Christians have organized their whole life's course and decision-making around the belief that a Middle Eastern rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago was God in the flesh, and that he died and rose from the dead. That is a weird thing to make the central fact of your existence. And it should cause us to wrestle. It should invite our humility. It should lead us to admit that we can't prove it to others, that we are not certain in the ways that the world defines certainty. But that lack of worldly certainty does not make our faith any less genuine, and it does not believe, or it does not mean by itself that we are doubters. And so with these thoughts in view, I wonder, what are you talking about when you talk about doubt? What are your faith? What labeled the doubt bucket? And what bigger questions might you feel freed to now ask? And I think now we will transition into a time of knockdown, drag out discussion, Q&A time that I think Reverend Kristen will facilitate. Thank you guys for listening, for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much, William, for all that. There's so much there. I had an opportunity to read through William's talk before tonight. Yeah, and there's so many good things. And so I have a series of questions to ask you, but before I even go there, I just want to open it up to you guys, because perhaps I don't even need to ask the questions. So what are the questions about doubt and faith that you're asking? Hearing William's talk tonight, what questions do you have of him, or what are the things that you want to wrestle with tonight as a group? So I'll leave it open to you, and then if we want, we can move into a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to let you kind of steer the boat for the moment. So any thoughts, questions?
This isn't so much of a question, but just a thought to maybe get some conversation started. William, I was really struck by what you said about the absence of religious feeling not being the same as doubt. And so when I think about the question that you left us with, what are we actually talking about when we talk about doubt? I feel like for me in my life, probably 75% of the time when I, even internally, am using the language of doubt, what I actually mean, if I really dig down deeper, is that absence of religious feeling. So it's just really helpful to hear that and to name that as something that you've experienced, heard others experience. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering aloud if there are other big categories of things that Christians in general tend to almost misidentify as doubt. So that's a rhetorical question unless someone has an interesting answer to it.
Yeah, that is a great question, Emily. So if any of you guys have thoughts on other things that we mislabel as doubts, speak up.
Yeah, I definitely felt like that middle point with the religious feeling hit me and so many of the people I know's experience, because we have been primed to think religious feeling is closeness to God. So yeah, I wonder if that's a big part of what our generation is now experiencing as doubt, because we're not having those same feelings.
Yeah, and I think our culture in general prioritizes feelings in so many ways. So yes, I think that's an important point that you made there, William.
And then I think about the example of Mother Teresa. Lord, let that not be so with me, that I would feel like I never feel the presence of God for the rest of my ministry, the rest of my life. It makes me wonder, when I place such a high value on that experience, that felt experience of God's presence, what sustains faith in the midst of that? I would love to be able to ask Mother Teresa to tell me more about that. But
yeah, and Emily, have you had a chance to read her letters?
I have not, but
yeah, I just say to everyone, it's maybe hard in some ways, but I encourage you to read. I'm forgetting the name, it has light in it, but it's all her letters that were published after her death. And it's interesting. Some people.
It's a collection called Come Be My Light. That was published by the spiritual director against her wishes after she passed away, to our great benefit and perhaps to her chagrin.
Yeah. Well, I do know that some people, not really fully understanding the story, have said actually she doubted, she was an atheist. But if you read the book, she absolutely was not. She was a person of deep faith who was sustained by her call and her sense of God in her life for all those years prior to those then 50 years where she had no felt presence of him. So I think she is an amazing example of faith, not what some people misunderstand to be doubt or unbelief. Yeah, so William talked about feelings. He also talked about the prosperity gospel in terms of quantifying, okay, I've gained these things in life and therefore I know that God's at work and I know my faith is working. Have any of you been in faith communities where you've experienced that, and sort of the measure of faith and the measure of whether it was working had to do with tangible blessings?
I just would argue in America, where we are trained from day one in the postures and practices and assumptions of individualistic consumerism, that it's baked into the DNA of almost all of our religious experience. Because I think the danger that I might be prone to criticism in what I shared earlier is to sort of say it's only one faith tradition that's to blame for all the bad stuff in American Christianity. And I don't think that that's true. I think that so much of the project of America has brought kind of consumeristic tendencies into even our faith experience, that in a lot of ways, all of us need to be self-examinatory. Is that a word? Need to give ourselves to self-examination to discern where are we making the metrics of our faith, the prosperity gospel, and the false promises it holds out that are not the promises of the biblical Jesus. I don't know if others would have sort of agreement or disagreement with that, but that's sort of my initial reaction to that is to not just assign it to, oh, I went to this one church that was really big into that stuff, and now I'm at the mission and it's perfect. No, like I think that this is a place for self-examination for all of us in our life, saying where am I trusting false promises that are more American than they are Christian?
That's really good,
Yeah.
William.
Yeah, that is super helpful, William. Having grown up in the Anglican tradition, I mean, I can definitely see that myself. I think for so many of us, we have different things, whatever they might be, that we make ends. So Jesus becomes the means to those ends versus Jesus being the end itself. And so, for example, one example would be marriage. So it's just like, you follow Jesus, you're going to get married, you know, and that's wrong thinking. So, and I can say for myself in particular, having gotten older and older and not being married, and there's certain ways that I thought God would provide for me if I followed him and if he loved me, and he hasn't provided it for me. It's shifted the way I've understood Jesus, and I do have faith that he's good and he has good intentions, and I've seen him act, but I've had to shift my thinking to be like, okay, Jesus loving me doesn't mean, for example, that I will get married. That's not part of his promise for me. Marriage is a good thing. We obviously all know it's a good thing that God gives us as a gift. But so I think you're right anyway, William, and just saying that this is not just one tradition, that this is something that we all have to wrestle with in our own ways. So it's going to be very different for each one of us.
That's right on. And I think for me, where I have experienced a draw toward, I guess, more of a prosperity gospel theology, is not in the communities that I've been part of, but an internal, almost desire for that framework to be true in moments that are really difficult. Because if that's the case, then I can just get really faithful. And I can just, believe a little bit harder in order to do away with whatever questioning and wrestling is actually there. So it's interesting to, think about how it's in our whole culture, but it's also in, in me, in times when I want desperately the kind of certainty that our culture talks about. I want the certainty. I don't want the faith that leaves room for humility and for wrestling and for questions and for that honesty. I actually really want the certainty in moments that are really hard.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important to say in response to that is that faith really only makes sense if you believe we're living in the midst of an eternal story, right? So like, this is where I think about like geometry, where all of kind of our consumeristic prosperity gospel tendencies, all the things that say like, I need good stuff for me now, that makes sense if we think that life and our existence is like a line segment that begins at birth and ends at death. Well, of course, if that's the totality of your experience, it only makes sense for me to want as much good stuff for myself as soon as I can get it right now. To not want that defies logic. But if you believe that your life is a line segment on a line that continues forever, in which you were imagined in the grace of God prior to the foundations of the earth, and you are going to be held by God into eternity of a continuous relationship with him in which you will receive the fruition of all for which you long, because he promises to bring a kingdom in which we will experience no longer scarcity but abundance. That is the only context in which a faith that could say, I choose to believe even in spite of circumstances in this present line segment because I'm trusting that future reality. That sort of eternal perspective is the only, I guess, perspective from which the life of faith makes sense. And I think if we don't live with that perspective, it's impossible for us to sustain faith. What do y'all think about that?
Makes sense to me. Question. So a lot of us, particularly on this Zoom call, are in ministry of some kind or just in normal like relationships where we maybe talk about faith. How do we reframe how we talk about that life of faith if we're not relying on some of those feel good feelings or empirical evidence or some of the things that you sort of reframe for us? Because because it's baked into my experience, a lot of times I just transmit that to others, even though I may know it's not, life of faith is not unicorns and rainbows. I feel like a lot of times in ministry, we want others to come to God. So we're like, it's great, so how do we reframe that? And also I'm just thinking of this reality of there are like marriage, you talked about marriage. It's like, you don't want to ruin somebody's honeymoon just because you're like, well, marriage is going to be hard later. So it's like, how do you balance all the different aspects?
Yeah, I don't know is my first response, but then my response beyond that is maybe to appeal a little bit to kind of some of the ideas that James K.A. Smith gives in Desiring the Kingdom, where his main argument in that book, to save you a couple hundred pages of reading that you should do anyway because it's phenomenal, and this will not give you the entirety of it, but he kind of pushes back on this idea that human beings are simply brains on sticks, that if we just change the way people think, then we'll change the world. He's like, that's not true, because human beings are fundamentally loving creatures. And we have to have our loves shaped and directed towards true and helpful ends in order for our lives to make any significant transformational difference on the world. And so I think about that almost in thinking about the life of faith is Jesus, when at the beginning of John's gospel in John chapter 1, when Philip and Andrew are stalking him in the woods or wherever he is, when they're pursuing him, kind of looking up behind rocks and sagebrush or whatever sort of backcountry plant grows in the Israelite wilderness, because I've never been there. Jesus turns around and says, "What do you want?" Which is a profound question, because I think we as Americans listen to that and we're like, well, I want an Xbox, or I want a good job, or I want a marriage, or I want whatever the thing is I think I need. We think about that as wants. But underneath our wants are indicators that point to something deeper, which is, what do you desire? Which I think is what Jesus is asking, is what is almost like the thing that you would be willing to labor for to bring into being in the world? What's the heart of your passion as a human being? And I think that wants and desires are not necessarily the same thing, that you can be connected to actualizing your desire in the world without necessarily getting what you want on the surface. And I think that, to me, is part of what the life of faith delivers, is that pursuit of Christ is going to connect us to activating more and more our desires without necessarily giving us our wants. And I think that sort of parsing and that diving is mysterious, and it's tricky, and it's hard to explain and talk about, which is why I think a lot of us tend to hang out on the surface and say, follow Jesus and you'll have 2.5 children and the white picket fence and the mortgage, because that's easier to talk about. But I don't think that that's the fullness of what God's after. And the other thing I'd say is that the wants, the nice house, the car, whatever, those may or may not participate in eternal realities. They may or may not continue beyond the end of this life. but I do believe our desires have resonance in eternity. I think that's why Jesus asks us about them, because he's almost like speaking to the best part of our hearts and saying, I want to irrigate that. I want to pour water on that and help it grow and become verdant. And I don't know if I have even more to say, because I think at this point I'm straying more into sort of unspecific metaphor, but that might be the beginning of how do you recast this, and sort of saying there's goodness on offer in Christ, but it's not the same offer that the rest of the things in the world are selling. Essentially, Jesus isn't selling us something. Jesus is inviting us to become something. And it's something that is lasting and eternal.
Yeah, William, I think that's super helpful. I think the other thing too, Savannah, and this has nothing to do with communicating things in words, but I guess when I see people of faith that I've been drawn to them, it's because of the virtues, the fruit of the Spirit that God has cultivated in their hearts because of their faith. So Mother Teresa is an example of that. I'm drawn to certain people, and so their life speaks for me. And I see how God has worked to create this amazing person, maybe not the perfect person, of course, but and that gets into like, that's part of my desire. Like, hey, I want what this person has. And so that's obviously not something we can manufacture. That's something that God creates on us over time. But I guess that's part of my hope, is that as we are walking with Jesus in faith, he's cultivating these virtues. And so we become attractive people. People are like, I want that. I don't see that your life has been super easy necessarily, but that is more important than getting my 2.5 children and all those other things that we say we want. So based on that, or anything else that William has said tonight, because again, there's so much here that we could dig into. Do you guys have any other questions or thoughts or clarifications about what he's meant or said?
Question, I guess. So maybe it's unfair to ask this, so you can choose to pass, William. We've kind of talked about like what doubt is not, and then the more general question of what are we talking about when we talk about doubt? How would you, and I would be curious to hear from others too, like how would you give a succinct definition of doubt?
No, I figured someone was going to ask me that, actually, reading through what I'd written today, preparing for this time. And I almost intentionally decided not to try to come up with an answer, because I almost wanted to call that as the question back to other people, to say, what are you talking about when you talk about doubt? I think, and I will answer your question, but I'm going to preface it with this, or give you a best shot at my answer. I want to preface it with this, that I feel like a lot of people who grew up in the church, and this is true, I think, both of people who would still consider themselves Christians, as well as people who would say, I've left the church, is we still all talk in this like Christianese jargon. Like we just say a word and we all know what it means, and we all think it means the same thing. And even right now, you look around in our culture and say there are a lot of words that are maybe more accessible in the sense that more people are talking about them. But like racism, for example, if someone says, I am a racist, or you are a racist, that can mean like 900 different things to 900 different people right now. And I think the same thing is true about faith and doubt. To say, well, I'm doubting, or I feel like my faith is strong right now, I don't think we can assume just by saying those things that we even know what we are talking about in that moment. And that's where I think the spiritual disciplines help us. So I guess in answer to your question, my best stab that I could make right now, which is something I'm hesitant to do since I know this is going to be recorded on multiple formats and someone's going to be able to criticize me for how lacking this definition probably is. But if we talk about faith being defined biblically as being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see, I wonder if you could define doubt in the opposite. that I have chosen to only be sure of what I can see. I've chosen to only be sure of what I know and perceive in front of me. I think that maybe gets at the heart of the repentance language that Jesus invites us to when he preaches the gospel of the kingdom. And when he says repent, he means change the way that you think. And I've been struck with this. We at the mission have recently finished. We haven't finished, but we've finished our next attempt to continue preaching through the Gospel of Luke. And I'm just struck watching Jesus. It's like Jesus is paying attention to a different script than everyone else. He's asleep on the boat when like the furious storm is coming. Everyone else is freaking out. It's like 5,000 people are there, and his disciples are like, how the heck are we going to feed these people? And Jesus is like, you do something. It's going to be cool. Like he is paying attention to some sort of totally different thing out there. And I think when he says, repent for the kingdom of heaven and near, he's like, are you seeing how I'm thinking? Are you seeing what I'm paying attention to? Are you seeing where I'm getting my cues from, which is what my Father in heaven is doing, which, by the way, is why I leave you every morning and go pray in the woods, is so I can be attuned in my heart to what my Father in heaven is doing, that I am seeking by God's grace to be sure of what I hope for and certain of what I do not see, in a way that frees me from a decision to only be sure of what I now have and only being sure of what I now see. I think that would be my stab.
I like it. It's a great stab. And what's really interesting to me about that is that if doubt, being the opposite of being certain of what we hope, actually that definition of doubt is how so many of us in our culture think about how we achieve certainty, by only being confident in what we can see and only having certainty in what's already before us. And so there's like a really interesting relationship there between
Yeah.
and certainty.
And a follow-up thought on that is that I think that we tend to think our life will be more secure if we only act in response to what we know is certain. But if you're looking at sort of like the Jesus script, how limited is that way of thinking? How many opportunities might you cut yourself off from if you only act on that to which you know you're certain of?
So Emily and everyone else out there, you heard William give his stab at a definition for doubt, and Emily, it sounds like you kind of concur. Do you or any of you have anything else that you would add, that when you think about doubt, how you would define it? Or how your friends or your colleagues or whoever you're having discussions with, how they would define it?
I'd be curious to hear what aspects of doubt people struggle with. I feel like when I think of it, a lot of times people are doubting the goodness of God and the reliability of God. And then that leads them to like question whether God exists at all.
Yeah, that's good. Because I mean, if I'm being personal with my sort of walk of faith, I had pretty strong faith that God loves me, but then I had to struggle with that very question of, does God love me? Because X, Y, and Z hasn't lined up in my life. And so that resonates with me, but you're right. Other people may have very different reasons for saying they doubt. So yeah, does anyone feel comfortable or sharing with any areas of doubt that you've had in the past? What was the cause of it? Or like, what were you questioning about God in that?
I get very frustrated. I don't know if maybe it's more frustration than doubt, but I get really frustrated with God's seeming insistence on not being as efficient as I think he should be from my perspective. And a lot of my times when I'm tempted to think God is not working is when he's not doing something as fast as I want him to, or in the way that I think he should.
William, I think I can resonate with a confusion between doubt and frustration. One of the points of great frustration for me that I think can lead to doubt in some sense is seeing not just the failures of the church, but actually the significant disunity of the church on a bunch of different fronts. And when that isn't just we don't get along kind of disunity, but actually some like significantly different ways of viewing God and understanding who God is, that that can mess with my brain a little bit. And I think, I value the tradition of faith, and I value, what has been passed down. And I think there's so much confidence that I gain in my faith from knowing that there are millions of believers, not just now, but throughout the ages, who have, held fast to many of the same convictions. And then when I have a moment where I realize, oh, actually, we might not all be on the same page. What does that do? So yeah, I know a lot of other people can be led to doubt when they see Christians behaving badly. But I can be led into that when I see Christians just disagreeing with one another.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. Well, we're actually drawing to the close of our time. I know that we all have more questions and thoughts, and this is something we're going to continue the rest with for probably much of our lives. And so, as William said before, if you're joining us from Facebook Live, or you're even with Zoom and you have other questions you haven't addressed, feel free to write something on Facebook, or obviously to reach out to William or to me directly, and let's continue this conversation. So thanks again, William, for getting us started with this great talk and discussion tonight. We will return again next week, same time, so 7:30 to 8:30 next week. Our own Emily Bingham will be our speaker, and she's going to be speaking about something very different. She's going to be speaking about Sabbath in a culture that cannot rest. And I think, Emily, I'm particularly interested in hearing this too in light of COVID. So like what conversations are opened up perhaps a little differently because of COVID that wouldn't have been there 6 months ago. So that's what you can look forward to next week. And again, we have a whole great lineup of very different speakers and very different topics. And so again, thank you for being with us for our first perspectives, and have a really great night.